There are stories we're told to forget, buried beneath textbooks, erased from sermons, sealed in archives that no one is supposed to open. But the earth has a way of remembering. Soil clings to secrets. Stones whisper names. And when night falls, the silence is never complete. It hums with echoes of rituals that were never meant to vanish. America was built on graves. That's not a metaphor, it's a fact. Beneath its churches, schools, and fields, there are bones arranged in ways that don't fit the clean lines of history. Some graves face the sunrise, others the stars, and some are turned upside down, as if the dead themselves were imprisoned beneath the weight of someone else's fear. These are not accidents. These are rituals. The kind the nation tried to erase. You've probably walked across one without knowing it. A park trail. A quiet road cutting through farmland. A new neighborhood with its neat lawns and fences. Yet just below your feet, there may lie bodies buried with coins in their mouths, shells pressed into their hands, or bound in iron chains, rituals brought from Africa, rituals born from native lands, rituals performed in defiance of erasure. They were meant to protect the dead, to guide them, to shield their descendants. But to the colonial eye, these practices were dangerous, unnatural. A threat to order. And so, the records were hidden, rewritten, and in many cases, burned, but history doesn't vanish cleanly. It rots, it festers, and it resurfaces when you least expect it. Strange accounts began to surface in court records, private journals, and forgotten archives. Bodies exhumed with nails driven through their skulls, skeletons rearranged into symbols no one dared to translate, coffins lined with objects that had no place in Christian burials. Each discovery was treated as an anomaly, a curiosity, filed away where no one would ask too many questions, yet when you connect the fragments, a pattern forms. And that pattern is terrifying. Imagine this. It is midnight, and you are standing in a colonial graveyard. The air is heavy with the smell of damp earth. Beneath your feet are bodies placed in positions that defy reason, face down, chained, or missing parts altogether. You hear the rustle of leaves, the faint creak of wood. And suddenly, you realize, these graves were never meant for rest. They were meant to bind, to contain, to silence. Someone feared the dead so much that they tried to cage them, even in the afterlife. Who were these people? Why were their bodies treated as dangerous? And what rituals did they carry with them that were so powerful the New World felt it had to outlaw them? This isn't folklore. These aren't ghost stories told around a campfire. These are real burial practices, documented, discovered, and then suppressed. Some belong to the enslaved, who smuggled fragments of their traditions across oceans and buried them beneath the soil of a stolen land. Some belong to native peoples, whose spiritual rites were criminalized, even as their bodies were dug up and displayed in museums. And others still remain untraceable, existing only as fragments, broken symbols carved into bone, charred artifacts scattered in the dirt, whispers in languages that no one living remembers. The deeper you dig, the more the lines blur. Were these burials meant to protect the living from restless spirits? Or were they meant to preserve something so dangerous, so uncontainable, that it had to be hidden beneath centuries of silence? Every civilization has its rituals for the dead. But the rituals America tried to erase weren't erased at all. They are still here, beneath the foundations of cities, in the cracks of rural graveyards, in the shadows of sacred places. And sometimes, when the ground is disturbed, they resurface, demanding to be remembered. Tonight, we will unearth them, because the truth is this: you don't bury a body to silence it. You bury it to plant something. And what was planted centuries ago is still growing, still reaching, still calling through the dirt, and once you hear that call, you can never silence it again. It began with a shovel. In 1991, construction crews in Lower Manhattan broke ground for a new federal office building. They expected rock, pipes, maybe the bones of old foundations. Instead, they struck something far older, a human skull. Then another. And another. By the time the digging stopped, more than 400 bodies had surfaced, some still bound in iron shackles, others buried with shells, beads, and carved objects that had no place in the Christian burials of colonial New York. At first, officials tried to contain the story. But the bodies would not stay silent. Their arrangement was too deliberate. Many were placed with their hands crossed in ways that matched West African funerary customs. Others faced east, toward the rising sun, a gesture of rebirth. Some graves contained coins in the mouths of the dead, a ritual meant to pay passage into the next world. These weren't forgotten paupers. They were people holding on to their traditions, even as the world around them sought to crush every trace of it. But there was something stranger. Among the careful burials were bodies twisted into positions that defied reason. Skeletons laid face down, as though forced into the dirt. Others nailed into coffins with spikes driven through their skulls or pelvis, rituals not of respect, but of containment. Why? Was it fear that the dead would rise? Or fear that their beliefs might outlive the chains that bound their flesh? The site became known as the African burial ground, and it shattered the sanitized story of early America. It revealed what textbooks had erased, that enslaved Africans carried not just their labor across the ocean, but their spirits, their cosmologies, their rituals of death. And those rituals persisted, even under the constant threat of punishment. For archaeologists, it was a revelation. For the descendants, it was confirmation of whispers passed down through families. But for those who uncovered the bodies, it was something else entirely, a warning, because once you see a burial ground, you can't unsee the pattern. The African burial ground was not an isolated case, it was one of thousands scattered across the land. Cemeteries paved over, bones unearthed and displayed like trophies, entire traditions reduced to footnotes or erased entirely. And yet, the graves themselves continued to resist erasure. The further researchers dug, the more evidence surfaced that these burials were not accidents of history. They were deliberate acts of preservation, rebellion, and sometimes, protection. Coins, shells, charms, carved figures, iron tools, all laid carefully with the dead. Each object was a message, coded in a language colonizers refused to understand. A language that said, "We will not vanish," but the question lingers, why were some graves reversed, shackled, or mutilated? Colonial records hinted at a terrifying answer. Officials wrote of superstitious practices, of rituals that frightened them, of fears that enslaved people could harness forces that Christianity could not control. Some journals even described bodies being exhumed and reburied with iron restraints, to ensure that whatever power they carried would remain trapped in the ground. Think about that. Authorities feared the dead so much, they sought to imprison them twice, and this fear wasn't limited to Africans. Across the continent, native burials were violated, altered, and covered up for similar reasons. Colonial officials wrote of witch doctors, of unnatural charms found with the bodies, of ceremonies they branded as demonic. Yet what they truly feared was not the supernatural, it was memory. The persistence of traditions too strong to kill, the African burial ground became a monument. But it also became a reminder, there are layers beneath every city, every field, every polished marble headstone. Some layers hold silence. Others hold screams. And some, if disturbed, might hold something else entirely, because the earth remembers what people try to erase. And sometimes, when it remembers too strongly, it speaks. By the mid-1600s, the colonies were not just experimenting with governments and trade, they were experimenting with control. Control of land, control of labor, and, perhaps most insidiously, control of memory. Burial rituals became one of the first battlegrounds. To colonial eyes, funerals were not private matters of grief. They were public displays of allegiance. A Christian burial, performed under the church's gaze, was a sign of order. Anything else, a drumbeat, a song in an unfamiliar tongue, a grave marked with charms, was rebellion. And rebellion, they decided, had to be buried. The laws came quietly at first, buried in local ordinances and church edicts. In Virginia, enslaved Africans were forbidden to gather after dark, even for funerals. In South Carolina, pagan practices at burials were outlawed outright, with punishments ranging from fines to lashes. In Massachusetts, native funeral ceremonies were condemned as devil's work, their grave goods confiscated and destroyed. The official reasoning was always the same: fear of uprising, fear of unrest, fear of contamination of the Christian order. But the deeper truth was simpler: they feared the persistence of memory. A people who can bury their dead with dignity cannot be erased. And erasure was the project of empire, but erasure leaves traces. Hidden in court records are accounts that read like fragments of a horror story. A white planter in Virginia writing of strange gatherings, at night, where enslaved mourners placed shells and stones in patterns around a grave. A missionary in Massachusetts describing how Wampanoag burials were infested with objects meant to guide the spirit. A sheriff in South Carolina recording the confiscation of fetishes from the bodies of the enslaved. Each entry is a scar, a faint record of a ritual outlawed but not extinguished, and yet, the laws were never enough. Rituals adapted, went underground, changed their shape but not their essence. Coins became buttons. Shells became small stones. Charms were disguised as trinkets or hidden inside clothing. Even within the strict confines of Christian burials, symbols of older worlds persisted, quiet, stubborn, unbroken. The colonists responded with cruelty. Some bodies were exhumed and reburied under the gaze of church officials, stripped of their objects. Others were chained, spiked, or mutilated before being lowered into the ground, an attempt not to honor, but to cage. Iron, after all, was believed to bind spirits. Nails through the skull. Shackles on the limbs. A grotesque inversion of burial, meant to ensure silence, but silence never lasts, because alongside the written laws, there are unwritten stories, Oral accounts passed down through descendants, fragments of memory that resisted centuries of suppression. Families spoke of graves where the soil never grew grass, of burial grounds where voices could be heard at night, of bodies that seemed restless, disturbed, as though they had been denied their passage. What the colonists feared was not superstition. It was persistence. Every outlawed ritual was an act of resistance, an insistence that the dead belonged not to empire, but to their people. Every confiscated charm, every smashed shell, every desecrated body was a failed attempt to silence memory, and yet, the laws had one effect the colonists never intended. By criminalizing rituals, they gave them a new, darker power. To bury a body with forbidden rites was no longer just an act of mourning, it was an act of defiance. A secret oath, whispered into the earth, and those oaths have not faded, because if you walk carefully, if you dig just deep enough, you will find them. Coins buried where no coin should be. Chains rusting in the soil where no prisoner should lie. Objects placed with such precision that they could only mean one thing: the dead were never silenced, and those who tried to silence them may not be resting easy either. The dead do not stay hidden. And no matter how many laws were written, no matter how many rituals were banned, the earth has a way of spitting up what it refuses to keep. Across the United States, construction projects and archaeological digs have uncovered graves that tell stories more disturbing than the official histories ever dared to admit. Consider the graves unearthed in New England, where bodies were found with their ribs broken open, their hearts removed and burned. To the local Puritan settlers, these were not burials at all, they were exorcisms. Communities believed the dead could rise again, carrying plague or curses upon the living, unless their remains were mutilated. They called them vampires. Scholars call them deviant burials. But look closely, and you see something else, a panic that stretched far beyond superstition. Or take the excavations in the Chesapeake region, where archaeologists uncovered graves containing iron tools, knives, and charms buried directly with the body. These were not possessions carelessly tossed into the dirt. They were protections, objects placed with intention, meant to shield the dead from being bound, or perhaps to shield the living from the dead's unfinished work. The colonists who stumbled upon such burials often reinterred them with iron nails hammered through the coffin, fearful of what these rituals implied. Even more chilling are the graves found in the Carolinas. Here, bodies were discovered turned face down, hands tied, sometimes with stones pressed into their mouths. To African and native traditions, the mouth was sacred, the passage between the breath of life and the silence of death. To fill it with stones was not protection. It was punishment. It was a way of saying, you will not speak, not here, not in this world or the next. But what did the colonists fear these bodies might say? The records provide only fragments. A planter's diary describing strange tokens unearthed in a burial. A missionary's disgust at pagan charms tied to a corpse. A sheriff's report noting that spirits were feared to walk after a certain funeral. Each is a glimpse into a fear that was never fully spoken, because here lies the uncomfortable truth: the colonists did not only fear rebellion in life. They feared rebellion in death. Every coin placed on a tongue, every shell clasped in a palm, every charm tucked into clothing was a declaration that the enslaved and the dispossessed still belonged to themselves. And in a world built on domination, that was the most terrifying rebellion of all. the archaeologists who uncover these graves today rarely describe them in whispers of curses or hauntings. They catalog them, study them, measure the soil chemistry. But even in the sterile glow of the laboratory, the unease lingers. Why were some bodies mutilated before burial? Why do the artifacts align so perfectly with outlawed traditions? Why do the graves cluster near water, near crossroads, near sites that in folklore always hum with otherworldly presence? It feels less like coincidence, and more like a message. Perhaps the strangest discovery came from a dig in Rhode Island. There, a skeleton was found carefully rearranged after death, bones deliberately broken and repositioned. A skull separated from its body. Ribs stacked in unnatural order. The marks of deliberate human hands, altering the body to prevent it from returning. To some, this was a folk exorcism. To others, it was evidence of something deeper, a ritual war fought in the soil itself, between belief systems colliding violently, each trying to trap the other in death. Imagine digging into the earth and finding not just a skeleton, but a warning. A ritual carved into bone. A symbol written in silence. A message that says, "They tried to bury us, but we will not be erased." The graves uncovered across America are not random. They are chapters of a story stitched together from fragments, bones, and ash. A story the colonists worked tirelessly to silence. And yet, each excavation proves the silence was never complete, because no matter how deep you bury the truth, the dead have a way of rising, and sometimes, they rise not to haunt the living, but to remind them. Long before the colonies, the land itself was a graveyard. Rivers, mountains, and caves were not just scenery, they were thresholds, places where the living touched the dead. Native nations treated these sites with reverence, binding their communities to the land through burial rituals that stretched back thousands of years. But when colonists arrived, reverence turned to violation. To native peoples, the burial was not an ending, it was a continuation. Bodies were placed in sacred mounds aligned with the stars, bones painted with red ochre to signify rebirth, offerings of tools and ornaments laid carefully beside them. Some burials took place in caves or at river bends, chosen for their spiritual power, where the dead could cross into the next world. These were acts of care, woven into cosmologies that saw the land itself as alive, but to colonists, these same rituals were threats. They saw mounds not as sacred monuments, but as obstacles. They saw grave goods not as offerings, but as evidence of idolatry. And so, desecration became policy. Burial mounds were leveled for farmland. Sacred caves were plundered for artifacts. Entire graves were dug up and displayed in curiosity cabinets and museums. Missionaries went further, outlawing native funerals outright. In Massachusetts, Wampanoag families were fined for burying their dead with gifts. In Virginia, Powhatan rites were denounced as heathenish enchantments. By the 19th century, government agents openly exhumed native graves, shipping skulls and bones to institutions under the banner of science. But some desecrations reveal something darker than curiosity. There are accounts, half buried in archives, of native bodies reburied under Christian rites, stripped of their objects, as if to sever their passage. Others were interred with chains or nails, the same grotesque methods used on African burials, meant not to honor but to bind. Why? because colonists whispered that native dead carried power, that their spirits could linger in the land, protecting their people, resisting conquest. To erase the people, the colonists believed, you had to control their dead, yet, the land remembers. Archaeologists digging in the Mississippi Valley have found mounds containing intricate alignments with the solstice, bones painted in brilliant red, and ornaments carved with symbols no one living can fully decipher. These were not accidents of culture, they were intentional, cosmic, enduring. And despite centuries of destruction, fragments of the sacred persist. Some stories say the land itself resisted desecration. Settlers reported strange misfortunes after disturbing burial mounds, crops failing, livestock dying, accidents claiming lives. Whether coincidence or curse, the pattern was enough that whispers spread, "Do not touch the mounds." But of course, they did. And the bones kept surfacing. Even now, developers uncover graves when digging foundations. Skulls emerge from riverbanks after floods. Bones slide out of eroded cliffs. Every time, the same unease surfaces. These are not anonymous remains. They are messages. They are warnings. They are proof that the sacred cannot be buried forever, and in some native traditions, to disturb the dead is to disturb the balance between worlds. The spirit does not rest when its body is desecrated, it lingers, restless, a reminder of what was stolen. The colonists may have thought they were silencing rituals. But in truth, they were igniting something else, a haunting carried by the land itself. Because if you stand at night on the flattened ground where a mound once rose, or by the cave where bones were taken, or by the river where offerings once shimmered, you will feel it, that hum beneath the silence. A weight in the air. A presence that does not leave. The sacred was stolen. But it was never destroyed. Chains can bind the body, but never the memory. When Africans were dragged across the Atlantic, they were stripped of names, languages, and homelands. But there was one thing that could not be taken, the rights of the dead. Those who survived the Middle Passage carried fragments of their burial traditions in whispers, in gestures, in the smallest of objects. And though overseers and missionaries tried to smother them under Christian rituals, the tradition survived, hidden, adapted, disguised. Funerals became secret battlegrounds. In plantations from Virginia to the Carolinas, enslaved people were often forced to bury their dead under church oversight, with hymns and prayers dictated by white ministers. But beneath the surface, other practices persisted. Coins slipped quietly into mouths. Broken pottery scattered into graves. Songs sung in tones that bent the Christian psalms into something older, something unrecognizable to the overseer's ear. Every burial became a negotiation between survival and defiance. The colonists saw obedience, a coffin lowered with a pastor's blessing. But the mourners knew the truth. The dead were being guided, protected, and claimed by their own people, not by the empire that enslaved them. Some rituals were subtle. A coin pressed beneath the tongue, disguised as a token for the poor. A shell clasped in a hand, explained away as ornament. A circle of stones placed at the grave's edge, easily dismissed as random. Yet to those who knew, these were powerful symbols. Coins ensured safe passage into the afterlife. Shells represented the sea, the water that divided the living from the ancestors, and the water that still connected them across the Atlantic. Stone circles marked boundaries, a sacred fence to keep spirits safe. other practices were harder to conceal. Night burials became common, funerals held after dark where drums and songs could rise without immediate punishment. Lanterns were carried in slow circles, imitating the turning of the heavens. Graves were sometimes oriented east, toward the sunrise, a sign of rebirth. To the colonists, these were superstitions. To the mourners, they were acts of survival, rituals that tied them back to the ancestors, that said, "We are not erased," but the blending of traditions was never pure harmony. Christianity became both a cage and a mask. Enslaved Africans were often forced to adopt biblical language in funerals, yet they infused those words with different meanings. The River Jordan, for example, became not just a biblical crossing, but a coded reference to the Atlantic, the great divide between the living and the ancestors. Heaven became not simply a Christian paradise, but a return to Africa, to home, and hidden within Christian hymns were rhythms that echoed far older songs, beats carried from Yoruba, Congo, and Akan traditions. Disguised in plain sight, the colonists tried to regulate it all. Laws forbade drumming, forbade gatherings at night, forbade burials without white supervision. But still, the rituals slipped through. Because death was one place where even slavery's chains could not fully reach. The dead could not be forced into obedience, yet there were consequences for defiance. Accounts survive of enslaved people caught placing charms in coffins, punished brutally for witchcraft. Graves were sometimes exhumed by overseers, their tokens confiscated as evidence of rebellion. And in the most chilling cases, bodies were mutilated before burial, bound in iron to prevent them from carrying their power beyond the grave. Still, the rituals endured. Over time, these disguised practices formed something new, a blend of African cosmologies and Christian veneer, a hybrid faith that carried both survival and resistance. What the colonists called superstition was, in truth, a language of defiance carved into the soil, sung into the night, whispered over the dead. The disguises worked. Tradition survived. And even now, archaeologists uncover the evidence: coins in mouths, broken pottery near graves, circles of stone marking burial grounds forgotten by maps but not by memory. Every artifact whispers the same truth: the dead were never abandoned. They were claimed. They were protected. They were remembered, and those who tried to erase them found that erasure is impossible when memory itself becomes ritual. The dead were never supposed to return. Yet, in the colonies, whispers grew that they did, for all their laws, their mutilations, their attempts to bury memory. The colonists could not shake one terror, that the dead they tried to bind were not bound at all. The soil did not always stay still. Graves were disturbed. Bodies were found in positions they should not be. And when sickness swept through villages, or cattle dropped dead, or children wasted away, the blame turned to the earth itself. To the restless dead. In New England, these fears took a name: the vampire. Decades before the Gothic tales of Europe reached American shores, settlers exhumed bodies believing the corpses themselves were draining the life of the living. Entire families would be dug up after a string of mysterious deaths. The most infamous case came in Rhode Island in the late 1800s, when the body of Mercy Brown was exhumed, her heart cut out and burned, her ashes fed to a sick relative as a cure. But such practices stretched back much further, folk remedies against a fear the settlers never admitted openly, that the bodies they buried did not stay silent, and not all restless dead were imagined. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where bodies were dismembered, ribs broken, skulls smashed and reburied. In some, the remains were rearranged into grotesque positions, as if the living had fought against something they believed could rise again. These were not random acts of desecration. They were ritual responses to a terror no law could soothe. But here lies the darker truth. Many of the bodies treated this way belonged not to colonists, but to the enslaved and the native dead. The rituals of restraint, nails, chains, stones and mouths, were justified as protection against spirits. Yet beneath the superstition lay a quieter admission. The colonists feared the very people they had tried to erase might return through the earth itself. Think of the irony. They outlawed African and native burial rites as superstition. Yet they created their own rituals of fear, born from the same soil. They branded charms and coins as witchcraft. Yet they hammered nails through coffins and burned hearts to ash, believing this would stop the dead from rising. Whose spirits were they truly afraid of? The records are thin, but they bleed unease. A diary from Massachusetts describing a specter seen near a disturbed grave. A Connecticut minister writing of heathen bones whose presence cursed the land. A sheriff in Virginia noting that locals feared strange lights near burial grounds. None of these entries name ghosts directly. But together, they whisper the same dread. The dead were not at rest, and in the silence left by suppression, folklore grew. Stories of glowing figures on crossroads at night. Of voices rising from earth when graves were disturbed. Of sickness spreading not by disease, but by contact with the unburied. Colonists explained it as the devil's work, but their actions told another story. They feared the dead because they had not buried them properly. They had tried to bind what was meant to be free. Even now, you can trace the fear in the landscape. Place names marked by Ghost Hill, Devil's Den, Witch Hollow. Sites where bodies were once exhumed, reburied, silenced. Yet the silence never lasted, because no matter how many chains were clasped, no matter how many nails were driven, no matter how many hearts were burned, the earth remembers. And what the colonists branded as restless dead may not have been restlessness at all. It may have been refusal to be forgotten. Refusal to let erasure take hold. Refusal to lie silent in a land that tried to bury them twice, and when the dead refuse silence, the living can only fear what rises. The past refuses to stay buried. Every few years, the news breaks the same way. Construction crews halt work, police swarm an excavation site, archaeologists are called in. And beneath the concrete and steel of modern America, bones emerge. They are not nameless. They are not silent. They tell stories that history books still do not want to tell. In the 1990s, Lower Manhattan's African burial ground shook the nation when hundreds of bodies were unearthed beneath a federal office project. But that was only the beginning. Since then, graves have surfaced under schools, highways, parking lots, suburban lawns. Every discovery forces the same reckoning. This land is layered with the dead, and many of them were buried in ways that do not fit the clean narrative of Christian America. Some graves reveal coins still tucked into mouths, even after centuries. Others hold charms, shells, and pottery fragments, all laid deliberately with the dead. These are not random artifacts. They are fragments of rituals colonists tried to erase, resurfacing like warnings etched into soil, but the most unsettling discoveries are the ones that match the old fears. Bodies face down. Limbs bound. Chains rusted around skeletons. Nails driven through coffins. Each one a grotesque echo of laws meant to silence rituals by replacing them with fear. The colonists buried their dread into the very ground, and now it rises again with every unearthing. Modern science catalogs these findings, measuring bone density, isotope levels, soil acidity. Reports are written in sterile language, deviant burials, ritual artifacts, anomalous positions. But even scientists admit unease. Why do so many of these graves appear near rivers, crossroads, or ancient sacred sites? Why are the same symbols repeated across hundreds of miles? Why do the objects often mirror traditions recorded as extinct centuries ago? And then there are the accidents that in Oklahoma, heavy rains unearthed coffins from a forgotten cemetery, bones washing into streets. In Florida, developers paving a parking lot found human remains beneath the asphalt, traced back to enslaved burial grounds. In Texas, a drought revealed skeletal remains at the edge of a riverbank, bones positioned with deliberate precision. Each time, the same cycle repeats. Officials promise memorials. Communities demand recognition. Archaeologists plead for preservation. Yet, the pattern keeps returning. Burial grounds paved over, erased, until the earth itself tears them back open. And the descendants? They know what the earth is saying. For families whose stories were stolen, each grave unearthed is both confirmation and grief. Confirmation that the traditions endured. Grief that they were hidden, denied, and desecrated for centuries. But perhaps the strangest thing is this: the unearthed dead do not just rewrite history, they seem to haunt it. Workers at excavation sites speak of unease, of strange noises, of shadows moving in corners. Machines fail without explanation. Crews report feeling watched. Some refuse to keep digging. Official reports never mention it, but the stories circle quietly, as if even in death the rituals still protect their own, because these burials were never just about the dead. They were about binding memory to the land. And memory is something the ground does not let go of. Each time bones rise from the soil, they bring the same message: the erasure failed. The silence failed. The rituals still breathe in the earth, in the shells, in the coins, in the broken pottery that no law could outlaw. And if the earth keeps opening, if the graves keep rising, then the past is not finished. The question is not whether America buried its secrets. The question is, how many more are waiting to surface? History likes to close its books. To label things finished, extinct, forgotten. But burial rituals are not history. They are living wounds. And in America, those wounds keep bleeding through the ground. For centuries, officials insisted the old ways were gone, erased by law, replaced by Christianity, forgotten by time. But the graves unearthed tell another story. So do the whispers in communities where memory runs deeper than paper. Descendants of the enslaved still mark graves with coins and shells, just as their ancestors did under the gaze of overseers. Families still pour libations, water or rum tipped gently into the earth, so the dead may never thirst. In native communities, bones and ashes are still returned to sacred sites in quiet ceremonies the law once tried to ban. These are not reenactments. They are continuations. Fragments of outlawed rituals, carried forward in secret, waiting for the moment when silence breaks, but silence never breaks gently. Every unearthed grave is not just an archaeological find, it is a confrontation. It says, "You tried to erase us, and we are still here." And with each discovery, the past pushes harder, demanding to be acknowledged. The unease that surrounds these sites is not imagination. Workers hear footsteps where no one walks. Visitors feel cold air in midsummer, a breath on the back of the neck. Archaeologists speak, in hushed tones, of tools breaking for no reason, of soil collapsing in unnatural ways, as if the ground itself resists intrusion. Science cannot explain this, but tradition can. In African cosmologies, the dead are not silent. They walk beside the living, demanding care, demanding respect. In native traditions, the land itself holds memory, and to disturb it without ceremony invites imbalance. If these beliefs are true, then every desecrated grave is not just history uncovered, it is balance broken, and the balance is breaking more often. Rising seas erode coastal burial grounds, bones slipping back into the waves. Droughts crack open riverbeds, revealing skeletons arranged in ancient patterns. Urban expansion bulldozes neighborhoods, uncovering cemeteries that city maps forgot but the soil never did. Each time, the dead return. Not peacefully, not silently, but insistently. The rituals outlawed centuries ago were meant to do more than honor the dead. They were meant to bind memory to the living. To ensure that even in the face of chains, laws, and erasure, a people would not vanish. And if those bindings still hold, then the dead are not gone at all. They are here, in the soil beneath our feet, in the air around the rivers and mounds, in the silence that hums when you stand too long near the disturbed ground. This is the truth America tried to bury. You cannot silence the dead. Coins in mouths, shells in hands, stones in circles, chains rusting in coffins. These are not relics. They are signals. They are proof that the rituals endure, that memory endures, that erasure failed, and if the dead are still calling, then it means the living were never meant to forget. So the question lingers, as heavy as soil on a coffin lid, when the ground opens again, and it will, what will rise with it? Memory? Justice? Or something darker, something born of centuries of silence and chains? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain. The earth is not finished speaking, and when it does, the silence we were taught to trust will split wide open. The story ends where it began, beneath the soil, but endings are illusions. They are neat closures written for comfort, not for truth. And the truth is this: the ground never forgets. America has tried to bury its past, again and again, layering concrete and steel over the bones of the unwanted. Federal buildings rise where sacred sites once stood. Schools and playgrounds sit atop cemeteries paved in haste. Parking lots stretch across fields where generations of the enslaved were laid to rest in silence. For centuries, the land has been rewritten, remapped, renamed. But the earth beneath those names does not change. It waits. The laws of the colonial era promised erasure. They banned the rituals, punished the families, chained the hands that dared to place coins or shells with the dead. And yet, centuries later, those same objects rise with the unearthed bones. Coins in mouths. Shells at wrists. broken pottery circling skulls. Not mistakes. Not accidents. But proof that outlawed practices survived the silence forced upon them, and silence, we see now, was never protection. It was only a pause. Every grave that surfaces speaks two truths at once. First, that the rituals endure, passed in whispers through generations, carried across oceans, hidden in plain sight. Second, that the attempt to erase them failed, and failure leaves scars. When bones are discovered chained, nailed, or bound, they do not just tell of oppression. They tell of fear. The colonists buried not just bodies, but their terror of rituals they could not control, of beliefs they could not erase. That terror is still in the ground, rusting in the coffins, pressing against the soil. The persistence of these rituals is more than archaeology. It is resistance. And resistance has a sound. A rhythm. A call that does not stop simply because history tries to write it out. That call is growing louder. Storms tear open coastal cemeteries, scattering bones across beaches. Drought cracks open riverbeds, revealing skeletons placed deliberately at the water's edge. Expanding cities stumble into graveyards erased from maps, coffins pulled from the earth like warnings. Each discovery is not an isolated incident, it is part of a pattern, a slow unraveling of silence. The earth itself is the witness, and the earth refuses to lie. What unsettles us most is not just the bones, but the presence around them. Excavators speak of air turning cold, of machines stalling without reason. Night watchmen report shadows moving where no one should be. Archaeologists admit unease but never print it in their reports. And yet, the whispers spread. The rituals were not only about honoring the dead, they were protections. Locks. Barriers. And when those are broken, something older seeps through. It is here that history crosses into haunting. Because when you look at these patterns, one truth emerges: the rituals were never meant to vanish. They were meant to bind memory to the land, to ensure that the living could never truly forget the dead. That binding still holds. Which means the dead are not gone. They are here. In the soil. In the rivers. In the silence that follows when you disturb ground too long ignored. So what rises when the earth splits open again? Memory? Justice? Or something darker, shaped by centuries of silenced grief? The coins. The shells. The chains. The broken pottery. They are not artifacts. They are signals. They are proof that silence was never enough, and as long as the blood keeps calling, the ground will keep answering. The silence never held, and it never will. We like to believe the past stays behind us. That what is buried remains still. That history is only words in books and plaques in museums. But the ground keeps reminding us, the past is not finished. Across America, forgotten cemeteries wait beneath the pavement. Beneath schools where children play. Beneath neighborhoods where families cook dinner and watch television. Beneath government buildings where decisions are made in ignorance of the bones that lie just a few feet below. Every inch of earth hides the chance of rupture. Every storm, every excavation, every shift in the soil risks pulling the past back into the present. The rituals outlawed centuries ago were never about death alone. They were about continuity, ensuring the living never severed from the dead, ensuring memory could not be erased by force. Coins pressed into mouths. Shells placed at wrists. Libations poured into the soil. Each act was a thread tying generations together. Those threads were meant to hold forever. If they held, then we are not alone. The unearthed graves suggest that these bindings never broke. That every ritual suppressed in public continued in secret. That every charm, every stone, every offering still hums with meaning long after the body decayed. The question is not whether the ritual survived, it is what they are doing now, because some believe the unrest we feel at these sites is not imagination. The cold air, the broken machines, the feeling of being watched, these are not accidents. They are signals. The land is not passive. It remembers. And when memory is disturbed, it responds. Think of what that means. For every parking lot laid atop forgotten bones. For every highway slicing through a sacred site. For every river redirected, every mound leveled, every grave desecrated. If rituals truly bound the living and the dead, then we are walking daily across broken promises. Across unfinished ceremonies. Across ground that was never meant to be silent, and silence, as history shows us, never lasts. One day, another storm will rip open the coast. Another drought will split the rivers. Another shovel will strike a coffin no map remembers. And when it happens, the dead will speak again, not with words, but with presence. With coins gleaming in dirt. With shells clutched in skeletal hands. With chains rusting where they should never have been. Each discovery is a reminder, but also a warning, because these rituals were not erased. They endured. And if they endured, then the past is not buried, it is waiting. So when you walk across a quiet field, or park your car on smooth asphalt, or hear construction machinery in the night, ask yourself, what lies beneath? And if the ground shifts, what will rise? History tells us one thing clearly, the silence never held, and the ground still moves. The screen fades to silence. But the silence is never real, because now you know. Beneath your feet, beneath your street, your house, your school, your city, the ground holds more than dirt. It holds memory. It holds chains. It holds rituals outlawed and denied, but never destroyed, coins pressed into mouths. Shells resting on wrists. Pots broken and buried in circles. These were not relics of superstition. They were languages, prayers, promises. They were meant to ensure that the living never forgot the dead. They were meant to bind people to the land, to each other, to the very soil beneath. Those bindings were meant to last forever, and they did. The colonists outlawed them. Churches condemned them. Governments paved over them. But still, they surface. Every storm that unearths bones. Every drought that cracks open rivers. Every construction site that finds coffins where blueprints claimed only soil. Each is proof that silence never held, but what unsettles most is not that the rituals remain, it is that they still work. Why do workers step back from open graves, swearing they feel watched? Why do machines stall when they strike burial grounds? Why do visitors to these sites report chills, whispers, shadows moving at the edge of their vision? Maybe these are accidents. Or maybe they are reminders. Signals. Warnings. because the rituals were never meant for death alone. They were meant for protection, for power, for endurance. They were not erased, they endure still, whispering through the soil, waiting to be recognized, and if they endure, then the past is not finished. Think of that when you walk across a park, when you drive a highway, when you pass a river at night. Ask yourself, what lies beneath? And if the ground split open here, in this moment, what would rise with it? Memory? Justice? Or something else, shaped by centuries of chains and silence? The ground does not answer in words. It answers in presence, in unearthed bones, in rituals that refuse to die. So the story ends here, but it does not end. The silence never held. The soil remembers, and the ground is still watching.